Hello, and welcome to En route, the podcast where we talk about life along the way. I'm Dennis Sanders, and I'm your host. Make sure to visit our website, enroutepodcast.org, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or via RSS, so that you'll never miss a show. And while you're at it, if you've found value in listening to this show, I'd really appreciate it if you would give a rating on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. That really helps us. Or simply tell a friend about the show, because that will help us out too. So today's podcast is about local news. And I want to start out with a story in 1986 in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. I was a junior in high school, and I went to this special conference for African Americans who were interested in a career in communications. And I remember going to the offices of my hometown newspaper, the Flint Journal. Now, I had followed the paper for years. I read it voraciously, and I was excited to be in the newsroom. And the newsroom of the 1980s was a place that had a number of journalists. It was a busy place. If you went downstairs, there was the printing press that was churning out the newspaper daily. Well, that was 35 years ago. Today, the Flint Journal is a much smaller paper. There are less reporters covering the news than they were in '86, and they don't publish a physical newspaper every day. They publish it, I believe, 3 times a week, and of course, most of the rest of the news is online. They're no longer in their grand building downtown, where you saw they had big windows on the ground floor so that people could look in and see the printing press. They've moved to much smaller offices downtown. Now, what happened to the Flint Journal in some ways is the changing nature of local news and newspapers in general. The newspapers of the 21st century are in a bad spot. They're either folding or facing downsizing. There are many cases where papers have been bought out by private equity firms, and those firms basically strip them to the bone in order to eke out a profit. There is a hole, basically, in news, the hole in local news, and that's really part and parcel of some of the changes going on in our culture as news becomes more national, and we focus on major issues emanating from Washington, while we ignore the bread and butter issues that are happening in our midst. So into this vacuum, there have been a few brave writers that have stepped in to provide local news, and today we're talking to one of those people. Kevin Hendricks is the editor of the West St. Paul Reader, a news website that covers all the news happening in West St. Paul, which is a Twin Cities suburb of 20,000 located just south of St. Paul, Minnesota. I talked to him this past week about why he got started into covering the local news and the importance of having people invest in those local stories, especially now in this post-truth age. So with that, here is Kevin Hendricks. So, Kevin, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So the first question I wanted to ask is, what got you in? Well, basically, maybe explain a little bit about the West St. Paul Reader. What is it about? How long have you been a part of this?
So we started in May of 2019. So we just hit our 2-year anniversary a month or two ago. And it started because I kind of got interested in my local community and what was happening right here where I live. West St. Paul is a first-ring suburb of St. Paul. We're right next to St. Paul, but we're also in a different county. We're in Dakota County instead of Ramsey County. So we're a 5 square mile suburb of about 20,000 people. So while we're right next to the major metropolitan city, and we're a part of the major Twin Cities area, we're within the 494 Beltway. We also have this weird kind of small town vibe, that we're a town of 20,000 people, and we're those weird 5 square miles with our own, business corridor of Robert Street. So it's kind of this interesting little community. And I kind of got involved in some of the local politics here. We had a tunnel project. There's a big river to river greenway trail project, is kind of where a lot of it started. And the idea was to have this greenway trail going through West St. Paul, and it would connect up to trails along the Mississippi, some trails along the Minnesota River. We have incredible trails in the Twin Cities, and this was an opportunity to link up our city to those trails. And one of the major obstacles was that Robert Street corridor I mentioned, which is our big 4-lane commercial corridor that you really don't want to bike across, especially if you're going on a bike ride with your family, a recreational thing. Crossing 4 lanes or 6 lanes at the intersection of traffic is just not fun. So there was this concept of, let's put in an underpass, let's figure out a way to cross Robert Street and make this greenway and do the whole thing. And there was surprising pushback on that. Like, that was not a slam dunk idea. There was funding from the state, so we didn't even have to pay for it. And it still wasn't a slam dunk idea. There was lots of pushback, and lots of people who said, oh, we don't need that. You're wasting your money. That land could be used for better things, all kinds of arguments. And we kind of thought, well, this is a no brainer. Let's do it, and started pushing on it. And that was back in 2017. And we kind of realized, like, oh, this is not an easy push. This is not an easy lift. And so we had to do, so a group of us was working on this, and I kind of did a lot of writing about it, kind of doing the research of, okay, what is this project? What does it cost? What are the different options? Why are people opposed to it? And kind of diving into all those arguments of, will it be used? What is, the county has studies on how many people are going to use it. Here's the numbers, like, yeah, it's going to get used. What does it cost? Well, there's, breaking down all the different costs and who's going to pay for it. And, well, we have all this money from the state, and it's not going to cost the city, and, well, if you don't use the state money, it goes somewhere else, and Apple Valley gets something really nice and we don't, so it's not like it goes back in your pocket as a taxpayer. So, kind of working through all those arguments, and slowly pushing that project forward and trying to advocate for it. They broke ground on it last year. This summer, they did the first half of it last year and the other half this year, and it should be finished up maybe by August or September. And we'll actually have this underpass, which will be part of the trail. And there's some other pieces that are being finished, but it's all kind of coming together, which will be amazing. But that whole process was kind of this deep dive into city council and local stuff and what was happening, and kind of the misinformation out there of people had this idea of, oh, this is crazy expensive and we can't afford it, and why would you waste the money on this? And then as you look into it, it was like, well, it's actually only this much money and we're not paying for it. There's federal funding, there's state funding, there's all this funding that creates all these beautiful trails. We don't have to have the city taxpayers on the hook for it. So it's kind of a great education into, people need to know these local facts more. There needs to be some kind of source of, what's this project over here? How are we paying for it? What's it cost? What's the benefit? Why do we want it? And so I had that kind of started me back in 2017 on local stuff. And from there, it kind of exploded. It was getting into local politics and city council races. This is a long story and I could go on and on. But there was a sexism controversy in 2018 with our first female mayor. That blew up and got national headlines. I was writing about that and a lot of this was on my personal blog, where I was just writing about what's happening. I got very involved in the 2018 election, door knocking for my city council candidate, which is something I never thought I would do. Um, and from there, like I was attending city council meetings all the time. I was involved in the minutia, um, and the idea started to form of we need some local coverage of, writing about West St. Paul.
And
Uh,
were there any kind of local news in West St. Paul? I know that there are a lot of kind of suburban newspapers and other suburbs throughout the Twin Cities.
yeah,
Was there anything for West St.
so
Paul?
we had the Lily News or Southwest Review. It had various names depending on online or print. At the time, we had that, and they came out like every other week, I think. So it was maybe a twice monthly, and they folded in. It was late 2018 or 2019. They stopped publishing. We still have The Voice, which is like a monthly newspaper, and they kind of cover the West Side and West St. Paul and the East Side, kind of a lot of different areas, but they're only monthly. Um, and the city pages, which they folded up, I think last fall. Uh, they obviously didn't cover everything, but when big stuff happened, they'd write about it. The sexism controversy they covered. They would cover kind of some other city council stuff from time to time. And the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune would occasionally do stuff. As big stories happen, they would usually get to it, but they certainly wouldn't cover your day to day. This Greenway, they maybe did a couple articles on it, but that was after a lot of pushing. So it just wasn't on their radar for small local stuff. So yeah, there was definitely a vacuum, especially when the Lily News folded. They had a reporter who would come to city council meetings, from time to time as she was able, and they would cover city council meetings. But yeah, they couldn't do a lot, and then they folded and were gone. So there was just not much at all. So unless your city was on fire, the Twin Cities media wasn't going to cover us. I mean, which makes sense. We're only 20,000 people, and the 1.2 million or whatever are in the Twin Cities. So yeah, there was definitely a vacuum, and I kind of felt like I could fill that vacuum. So I had this idea for the West St. Paul Reader, and let's do local news. Let's talk about, certainly city council meetings were a thing I wanted to do, but also just interesting personalities in our city and what's happening and events and just all that kind of stuff was kind of what I wanted to cover.
And how, I don't want to say successful is probably not the right word, but what has been the response since you've started? Has the community really kind of noticed and joined in?
Yeah, it's been really encouraging. I started with a Kickstarter project, kind of saying, if I can get enough money to make this worth, buying a website and building it and, investing my time into it, then I'll do it. And I had about 65 some people back the Kickstarter campaign. I forget exactly how much we raised. It was $3,000 or $4,000. So I was able to build the site, hire a designer to create a logo. So I didn't have to do that because I'm not a designer. Able to bring in a few people to help me with some of those things and not feel like I'm just spending my own money on that. And then from there, maybe 6 months later, I started on Patreon, which is kind of a membership, monthly membership thing. People pay, $3, $5, $10 a month to support you. It's often used for artists or creators or anybody doing this kind of community supported thing. Jumped on there and kind of had a couple advertising options for like $25 for local businesses, and then $3, $5 for just people who wanted to support local news. And that's been growing steadily. We're up to about 86 supporters on Patreon right now, which is just, I'm very grateful for them. It gives me enough income that I can continue to spend time on this and justify doing it. I love doing it, so I spend way more time than I should, but that's my problem. I'm a freelance writer, and that income basically makes this one of my steady clients. It's not a huge chunk of my income. It's maybe 5 or 10%. But it's steady income that I can rely on every month, that I can justify, going to a 3-hour city council meeting and spending the time to write an article, because I know I'm getting some sort of payment and income out of it. So yeah, the support has been really great. There's been traffic has definitely been steadily rising, and as we have big stories or big controversies, it explodes, and it's wild to see people talking about it. I still have the moments where I come across people who don't know what's going on in town, and I was at a local restaurant last night with my wife, and the table next to us started talking about some of the local issues, and it was everything I could do not to butt in and hand my business card and you should check out West St. Paul Reader, and I know, be the dork who knows all the answers. And so there are still those moments where people, not everybody knows about it, certainly, but yeah, it's definitely getting out there, and so encouraged and thankful for the support.
It seems like that if you look at this from a kind of a national viewpoint, there seems to be more and more of a growing gap when it comes to local news. Papers, well-known papers that would have had fairly large staff to cover local news, both in the kind of the big city and suburbs, don't have that anymore. And I think you shared an example kind of as we were talking before we started recording of the Pioneer Press here in St. Paul. What do you think is the effect of that, of larger papers, whether it's kind of the Star Tribune and Pioneer Press, but even some of the local chains that usually have provided local news are starting to disappear?
Yeah, I think it's a major hit to kind of local engagement and knowing what's going on. We're in this weird partisan space where everything is hyper divided, and it's hard to know facts. We've just gone through the pandemic where there are all these conspiracy theories. We just went through the January 6th insurrection, and there's all these conspiracies around it. Having facts and knowing the truth of what's happening is something we struggle with as a society right now, which is kind of scary. And not having that on a local level just kind of perpetuates the whole thing. It's almost like the bottom drops out because you don't know what's going on, in your community down the street. So it's hard to have any sort of anchor. It's hard to have that foundation of, well, at least I know my community and I know what's going on here. I know what the mayor's doing, or I know what, the happening at the park or the construction project, or, whatever's going on in your community. It's not national news, but, you'd like to know what's going on around town. And I think losing that kind of just unmoors us, maybe, that we don't have that sense of what's going on. And it kind of just fuels that conspiracy theory because you don't know what's going on. And so there's all sorts of disinformation. There's all sorts of, at the restaurant the other night when I was hearing these people at the table, I kept hearing them throw out facts and figures and things that were completely incorrect. They were talking about construction on Robert Street and why they were ripping out the median and what they were doing, and they were upset about it, and was like, well, actually, that goes back to this trail project we're working on, and that's why the median got ripped out, because they're doing the trail project, and as soon as it's done, they'll put it back, and that's why it happened that way. And they were also talking about this. Our high school just went through a renaming process. Henry Sibley High School is now going to be Two Rivers High School, which has been a big story the past 6 months. They were talking about that as well, and they were throwing out some cost figures about what it's going to cost to do the name change, and they had the wrong figures. You get into the nitty gritty, but I know all the details because I'm the nerd who covers this stuff. But I'm sitting there going, "Oh, that's wrong. Oh, that's wrong. Oh, So yeah, and I think part of that was because there just hasn't been the major coverage of that story that goes into those details. And so, yeah, they don't have the facts, or they read it wrong, or whatever. And I think that just, that kind of cascades into all these other things of, of national importance, where we just lose trust and we lose, we just lose that kind of knowledge of what's going on, and I don't know what the word is, kind of that comfort of, not comfort, but kind of that, I don't know, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things that was, as a kid growing up in Michigan, is obviously I remember as a kid, my parents and I myself would read the Flint Journal, which is the, because I'm from Flint, that's what we read. But we also, I remember my parents also got a subscription to the Detroit Free Press, and they would read that. And I think there was a lot of, at least back in the day, people would take in that information from those local papers. And that was a regular habit that I don't think we have anymore. It seems like that's changed, and I don't know if that's because we've moved more online than we have in the past. But yeah, I think there was a sense of comfort in knowing what the issues were, and probably that we don't have that now makes that much more untethered.
Yeah. I grew up in the Detroit area, and we read the Detroit Free Press too. I remember coming home from school and reading the paper. Now, granted, I was a kid, so I read the comic section.
Yeah, me too.
But I even remember, in middle school and even high school, they had like a pop culture news thing, and I remember reading that every day after school. Just kind of wanting to be plugged in and knowing what was happening. And yeah, I remember even 20 years ago, I'd start my day, I'd read the online news, whether the local paper or CNN or whatever, to get some headlines. And I've even probably moved away from that probably in the last decade. And I don't know if that's social media or that's probably what's replaced it for me. Which is a weird thing to say as somebody who writes news, that I get my news from social media. But yeah, I think kind of those habits of the daily paper. And I imagine some of it is busy. I feel like the busyness just always ramps up, and finding time to sit down and read a newspaper, whether it's in print or online, we probably don't take that time anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. And I think, why do you think it is, especially local papers don't cover as much local news as they used to?
This is going to sound cynical, but I wonder how much of it has to do with kind of the controversy and the stories that get eyeballs. Because your city council meeting does not get eyeballs. Nobody cares. It's boring. As I said earlier, there's the feast and famine of most of the time it's boring. It's a 3-hour meeting about, what kind of road overlay are we going to do on this section of the street? And yeah, nobody cares. Or it's the other extreme of people screaming at each other, and the citizen comment that goes off the rails. And one of those gets eyeballs, and happens very rarely, and one of them doesn't get eyeballs, but it happens all the time. So I think and I see that in my traffic. Most of my city council posts don't get a ton of traffic unless something happened at the meeting. It's these stories about the renaming of the high school that get crazy, crazy, crazy traffic. But it's the story about, my neighbor down the street put in a little free pantry this spring. And so I interviewed her about that story and how it was inspired by her mother, who passed away recently, and just a really interesting story. And it does not get the traffic. And it kills me to see the traffic comparison of, this amazing story about a thing in our community and this, heartwarming thing, and nobody reads it. But the renaming mess and fight, like tons and tons and tons and tons of traffic goes to that.
Do you think part of that is just because of the national culture war issue? Everything is well, everything it seems now is culture war, as over and opposed to what used to be called human interest stories. That
I
we
think
just
that's a
don't have that interest or that interest anymore in those things.
I think that's a big piece of it. We really want the fight. We want to know like those controversial stories are the ones that people want to know about. So it's interesting looking at my traffic because I have two stories that are huge every time. One is definitely the controversial story. It's this high school renaming story. So I've probably written 5 or 6 posts on it since they first did the vote till they renamed it this week. And every single one of them has had huge traffic. And I knew that going in. We had a mural controversy this spring that got national attention. There was a Black Lives Matter mural
Oh,
painted on
yes, I
somebody's
remember that one.
fence.
Hmm.
And according to city code, you can't have a mural on a residential fence. So that blew up and got national news, crazy traffic. A former mayor made a Blue Lives Matter mural in response to it. The whole thing blew up, crazy, crazy traffic. So I know when those stories, most of the time, I know when those are going to take off, which ones are going to be hot button issues. The other story that is crazy huge is the new restaurant or construction project or thing coming into town. So we just got world famous Momo just opened on Robert Street. Momo is like a dumpling kind of thing from somewhere in Asia. I'm forgetting the details. I've never had them before. But a new restaurant in town. I do a 3-sentence post because there's no details of new restaurant opening soon. Here's the thing, whatever. Crazy traffic, off the charts. So those kind of stories, like the Kmart that's getting torn down because it's been empty for 4 years. They're putting up apartment buildings. That story I wrote 2 years ago. The construction's happening now. So that story has been popular for 2 years. Every time a new construction thing happens, those stories take off, and people are wanting to know what's happening. The Burger King got torn down. What's happening? Well, they're building a new Burger King. Crazy traffic because they tore the building down. So those things, fights, and kind of the immediate big change in my neighborhood, I guess you'd say, are the stories people want to hear about. And it's too bad because the really interesting stories, the human interest stories, the little free pantry down the street, or I did another one on a seed library. There's even a woman who wrote a novel that was reviewed by the New York Times. She lives down the street. Not a ton of traffic, just does not get the interest compared to that. Definitely the fight. I mean, those are the big stories. So yeah, I think that all that to say, I think we're kind of losing interest on what should be interesting, and it's almost like we want to watch a fight all the time. And that can't be new. I mean, I feel like people have always been like that, but it feels more, I don't know if it's accentuated now or if it's exaggerated, or something about it feels different. I know we've always been like that. That can't just be, people have always liked watching blood and gore and fights and drama and whatever. But yeah, it definitely feels heightened in this time.
So I'm kind of curious what you would think about things like Substack. I know, everyone knows that they seem to be the go-to place for a lot of more high-profile writers and everything, but they seem to want to help local people. And there have been examples of people who have started, and these are people who may either have a job at a local newspaper already or have left and are starting something that's focused on local news, and they are actually giving out grants to these people to kind of help further along, in some cases to hire a reporter, an extra reporter or something like that. Do you think efforts like Substack or any other type of platform can be helpful in maybe reviving an interest in local news?
So I have to admit, I know next to nothing about Substack, so I haven't followed that very closely. Um, has there been controversy about that? I feel like I've heard negative stories about Substack, but again, I haven't dug into it, so I
As far as I know, I have not heard negative. That doesn't mean
okay,
that there hasn't been. Um,
okay. Again, I haven't dug deep, so I'm hesitant to say much about that one. I don't know much about it. Um, I feel like there's always been lots of efforts to do that kind of, I don't know if it's a national approach to local news, but kind of that, the big nationwide company that wants to do local stories. I think Patch is maybe a site that tries to do that. Um, and it seems like it tries to use technology to, I don't know, to make that work, to kind of make the scale work, and it never seems to. Like I feel like those kind of places always seem to miss the mark somehow. Um,
do you think it's because they put too much effort on the technology and not enough on the human factor?
I'm not sure what it is. I don't know. Because I'm a big fan of technology and the
Hmm.
way the internet can bring things together and allow us to do all this stuff. I mean, I this I wrote for Church Marketing Sucks for 15 years, ran that site, and it was all about bringing church communicators together and helping churches do their marketing and communicate better. And there was just this incredible thing with technology where we could bring all these people together who were totally disconnected and thought they were alone, and kind of help them find resources and help them learn and even connect locally. We used to have a group that met here in the Twin Cities. Um, so there's a lot of power to that connection that the internet brings, and I don't know what's missing when it comes to local news. If it's um, I mean, a lot of those efforts have often felt like they're, I don't know, like you're parachuting in and you've got somebody who doesn't know the local area trying to write about it. If that's the disconnect, where they haven't found that truly local boots on the ground component of it, or if it's not having the quality of, maybe they have somebody on the ground but the quality isn't there.
Hmm.
They found somebody but the person's not a writer. They don't have any journalism chops to dig into stuff. So yeah, I don't know quite what's missing there. I feel like local news is a hard nut to crack. I mean, it's not a way to get rich. I'm certainly not, retiring on West St. Paul Reader by any means. Um, so yeah, it's kind of a weird space to try and figure out how to make it make money and make it sustainable. And I mean, I'm not out to make money. I'm out to, if I can pay for my hours and not go broke doing it, that'd be great. Um, but yeah, it's kind of a weird model. I mean, NPR is an interesting model where I
Hmm.
think NPR here in the Twin Cities is successful and seems to make that listener support work, and they seem to do a pretty good job at local news. As far as the Twin Cities, they cover the whole Twin Cities, so again, they're not doing small suburban news. But yeah, trying to figure out how to make that local news model work is, I don't know if anybody has fully cracked it.
Has anyone ever contacted you about asking about how maybe that they have expressed interest in doing something of their own locally, and maybe have they ever contacted you for advice or on how to get started?
Not a lot. I'm trying to think of specific examples, and I'm coming up blank. Um, I was going to say, I feel like even what I'm doing isn't very, it's not something you could replicate very easily, I don't think, because I'm a freelance writer, so I have the flexibility to kind of do city council meetings and write stories during the day and, do what I need to do to cover it. Where, if you had a 9 to 5 job, you're certainly not doing that. And you're certainly not going to quit your 9 to 5 job to start a local news site about a town of 20,000 people. That's not happening. Um, so yeah, it's a hard space to get into, and I feel like you definitely need the right person who's interested in that kind of local, hyper local angle. Um, in some ways, I think that's kind of rare. We're weirdos, I think.
Well, there is nothing wrong with. I think the world needs weirdos. So at least that's what I tell myself.
I like that. That's good.
Well, what do you think is the future for local news? What do you think is the future for the reader? But where do you think we're going as a society when it comes to local news? Do you think that we're just going to stay in this kind of nationalized way of doing things, or will we have some sort of a balance again?
I don't know. Predicting the future is not something I'm good at, and I don't know where it's going to go. The cynical side of me thinks I don't know how we get out of this kind of partisan spiral. I had hopes that after the 2020 election things would get better. Somewhat naively, I knew at the time, because we'd been through so much upheaval. I knew it wouldn't just fix automatically. But yeah, that kind of got uglier than I thought it would, with all the denial of the election results, and then leading up to the January 6th kind of insurrection. I didn't see that coming, and that was kind of jaw dropping, and doesn't give me a lot of hope. If anything, just makes me more cynical that things are going to be messed up for a while. I don't think we're going to figure this out and get back to normal, whatever normal is. So yeah, I don't know how or what we're going to do. You hear all kinds of stories all the time about local newspapers, and I'm talking major, the Free Press, the Pioneer Press, the Star Tribune, getting gobbled up by these multinational conglomerates or whatever, and they're cutting the staff to the bone, and they're trying to squeeze every dime out of the paper, which is usually never good for local coverage. So I don't see that trend going away. I've heard, I've seen various conversations about what should be done to change that local news is a common good, and therefore, the government should invest in it in some way. I've heard conversations about how that can happen in a way that's not government-run news, because that's not a solution. But how they could invest in that. You see, like public television, there's some government investment in that. So is there a way to fund local news kind of as a common good? I think that's an interesting conversation. I don't know where it goes. I think efforts like NPR and what I do, where it's community supported, I feel like that's a model that seems to work or can work. It certainly takes a lot of time and a lot of, I've been doing this 2 years to get to 85 supporters. So 85 supporters is, in some ways, doesn't seem like that many from where I started. It's huge. So it definitely took time to get there. But I feel like that community model has some benefits. But yeah, where we go from here, I don't know. I feel like in terms of West St. Paul Reader, I feel like we have a good future, and we have good growth, and we're kind of making a place for ourselves where people are starting to know about us and turn to us for what's happening. And that's really positive. I can see that kind of going forward in the future, and having that steady support and kind of being able to provide that local news. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. I'm kind of rambling a bit. But yeah, I feel a mix of hope that what I'm doing is at least working and supporting itself. But also I have a lot of cynicism about where we go as a larger society, especially nationally.
What stories are you working on right now that are of interest, that you think will be of interest to your community?
Yeah, so I've always got stuff in the hopper. It's interesting because it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, of what stories always get the clicks and what don't. Most of what I'm working on are the stories that don't, because the stories that get all the clicks kind of come at you by surprise, or you don't realize they're coming. Um, so yeah, some of those stories I'm working on. I mentioned a seed library and a little free pantry that I did stories on, and I have another story about just little free libraries in general with the books. I've interviewed several neighbors, and kind of have kind of an interesting piece, I think, interesting about how little free libraries work, and what people like about them and why people run them. I've got that coming up. There's a local woman who does quilting, and she has a quilt in a national museum. They're doing a big I don't know, retrospective display on modern quilting, and she has a quilt in that display. So I'm doing a story on her, kind of the quilting, which is I find fascinating. And I'm working on a story today about a local high school student who just graduated, and I think her softball coaches and some other people. I'm still getting the details. And they're putting together kind of a Latino sports, trying to recruit Latino girls into sports, kind of this, get them started young, because they don't have, in a lot of ways, they don't have some of the opportunities. And so they're trying to help fix that. Our area has a heavy Latino population. And so it's called, I'm probably mispronouncing it, Ella Avananza. I think it means she advances. But they're doing like a free softball clinic this week, where they're giving the kids all the gear. So if you don't have bats and gloves and shoes and whatever stuff you need, and then teaching them the ropes and kind of getting them into the basics of softball. So that's kind of a fun story. That was actually one I didn't quite see coming, and just heard about it actually last night, and was want to jump on it quickly, because it's kind of a cool story of people seeing a need and wanting to fill it and coming together. And there was like a softball gear drive at one of the high school softball games, I think, and so it's kind of a cool community thing that's happening there. So that's a few of the stories I have kind of in the works.
And hearing all of that, I mean, there are all fascinating stories, and it sounds also like what you were saying earlier, they're probably not going to be the ones that get a huge amount of clicks. But why do you think that they matter? What makes them important?
I think they're the real stories of our community, of what's happening. I mean, yeah, the new restaurant is great, and it'll be fun to have I've never had Momo before. I should try that. That's cool. That's fun. But it's a restaurant. It's not, it's not life-changing to me. But these stories of what individual people are doing that is our community. That's our people. The softball clinic might be life-changing for some of these girls, getting them engaged in a sport, and getting, all the benefits team sports can have, and getting them involved and introduced in that. And that's something they might not have otherwise gotten. They might have not have had the chance to do that. Whether it was just not knowing the skills and not knowing how to do it, or not having the money for the equipment. So somebody doing that, and a high school student doing it, leading the charge on that, is just an inspiring story of our community, coming together. And talk about hope, and hope for the future and where things are going. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm a big fan of books and reading. So little free libraries are just cool. And, the idea that these people have this love for books and want to share that with their neighbors, literal neighbors of the people on the street, walking down the sidewalk. Again, that's incredibly hopeful. Sometimes it feels like we don't know our neighbors and we don't know the people around us. And I love getting to know my neighbors. I love, knowing what's going on, and how I can help, and, being there for them. And that only happens when we know each other and we know what's going on and what they need. So you got to have those connections. So I think all these stories kind of help build those connections, and give that sense of hope, and kind of how we can contribute and be a part of this community. So yeah, that's why I think they matter. One of the beautiful things about having community support is it doesn't matter if my stories get the clicks or not,
Mm-hmm.
which I love, because then I can do these stories and I don't have to worry about, oh, the story about the little free pantry isn't getting the traffic. Well, so what? That's not what pays my bills, and that's beautiful. I love that. And maybe that's a way local news needs to get better, is that we need to not get paid based on the advertising. But kind of that change in the funding model.
Yeah, it really all comes down to the funding model. And that's been really, I think, the question that at least, well, journalism as a whole has been trying to answer for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're any closer to getting.
And that's a hard thing to deal with, because if you can get piles and piles of money for those, major stories that everybody fights about, like, why would you turn that down? Like, they're just incentivized to keep doing it. It totally makes sense. So yeah, I think that difference definitely helps me, because then I can kind of unplug and be like, I'm a kind of guy who wants to look at the traffic all the time and, ooh, how am I doing and where's it going, and which is not healthy for me. So it's good to be able to unplug and be like, no, that doesn't matter. I don't get paid based on the clicks. I don't need to go, flog the story on Facebook so I get more clicks. Like, no, I don't get paid more for that. So don't waste my time on that. Yeah, but it helps me to focus on the stories that do matter and what can build up our community and kind of build on that hope and make things better for the future.
So if someone out there maybe has heard this and is interested in doing something like what you're doing, what tips would you give them?
Oh boy. I think a big thing you need to have is kind of curiosity. You got to have kind of a drive and a curiosity to know what's going on and to find out the stories and to figure out what happens. I mean, a lot of the stories I do are kind of answering questions of people talking about, okay, you have this trail and you want to do an underpass. Why does that make sense? Why should we do that? And I have a curious nature, and I kind of dig into, like, well, okay, why is that a good thing? I like to ride my bike, so it's great for me, but why is that good for everybody else? Why are sidewalks beneficial? West St. Paul did a huge reconstruction of Robert Street 5 years ago that was very controversial, where they put in a median. So why are medians a good thing? So for me, diving into the traffic data, which sounds really boring, but tells you about the safety of medians and how they reduce the accidents, make them less severe, which saves lives. So kind of digging into, having the curiosity to dig into those kind of details, I think, is incredibly important. Because otherwise you won't stick to it. You won't, you might get bored with it, or you got to have that drive to keep going. So I think that's a major part of it. So maybe start there, and start talking to people. I've talked to a lot of the people at City Hall who do the work. I bug them all the time, asking questions and trying to find stuff out. So you got to kind of get to know people and kind of form those relationships where you can hear about the stories. And I mean, all these stories I've done with the softball clinic and the Little Free Library and the quilting, those all came about from relationships, talking to people of, I know somebody who lives next door to this Doctor Who Little Free Library. So I wanted to hear the story about their TARDIS library, which was cool, but only happened because I knew the guy who lived next door, and I, drove by it one day. Or the softball clinic, they reached out to me because I'd been supporting some other stuff that happened in town, and so they knew about me. And so anyway, those kind of relationships are so important. So maybe that's where to start. I'd have a lot of advice, so I guess I'd say reach out to me, and I'd be happy to share what I can.
One quick question before we kind of wrap things up is that I know you also have another project where you wrote a book. on politics, and I believe it was the Better Politics, Please.
Yes,
Um,
politics, please.
and I think it seems like it's something that is sorely needed now, in that it's trying to find ways of people reaching out to one another.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about the book, and how has it been successful and people been reading it? And
Yeah, so the whole premise of the book was, we're in this hyper-partisan age. Oh my gosh, can it be better? Can't we get along? So I set out to look at different politics from local to the federal level, and find something to celebrate in them, whether I agree with them or not. So I looked at both sides of the aisle. I tried to find all kinds of people. I looked at people I don't like and disagree with, and I tried to find, okay, what is it about this person that I can celebrate? You know, I don't like their politics. I hate how they handle it, but what can I find? So I found 35 people from across the country. Not all of them are great examples of bipartisanship. You know, so it's not about that. Sometimes it's about, again, finding that one thing to celebrate even when you disagree, which can be hard. And some of them are good examples of bipartisanship. So kind of all over the spectrum. You know, for example, I profiled Dan Crenshaw, the congressman from Texas. He's very controversial. I completely disagree with him. He drives me nuts. But he had some great things to say. He went on Saturday Night Live. They made a joke about his eye patch. He lost his eye in Afghanistan. They made a bad joke about his eye patch, so they brought him on the next week and apologized. And he kind of had a great thing there talking about, you know, we disagree, but we need to, you know, find a way to get along. And you know, so he had his moments there, which I could appreciate. So it's a story like that I kind of dive into about who is this guy, and he sometimes grates people the wrong way, but you kind of got to dive in sometimes and get past some of that. And some of it was local people. I'm trying to think of some examples. Like there was a mayor in Tucson. You know, she's worked on planting trees and kind of helping with some of that climate stuff. And I think they had a big, I think it was a sanctuary city push, and she's Latina, and she was actually against it, and kind of had this, you wouldn't expect her to be against it. She kind of felt like the state politics, I think, were really divisive, and she thought this would further that divide, and you know, the state would like override them and just cause more controversy, and so she didn't want to have that. So just those kind of things where you don't expect it to go that way, and they kind of flip your expectations. So that's kind of the premise of the book. I wrote it last year during the kind of in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of the election, which was a weird time to write a book like that. I tried not to touch the presidential election at all, just because that's so so
sounds smart.
Yeah, and definitely looking at local politics. There's some city council members in there. There's some mayors, state representatives, as well as senators and congresspeople. But kind of giving that broad swath of politics and how we can you know, figure out how to come together and not be so divisive.
Mm-hmm. So if someone wants to check out the West St. Paul Reader, where should they go?
weststpaulreader.com is our website. Yeah, all the details are on there. You can contact me through that. There's a contact page. And yeah, you can reach out to me through that. The book, betterpoliticsplease.com, will take you to the landing page for that. And that book is available on Amazon and or through me or whatever works.
Okay. Well, Kevin, thank you. This has been a really great interview, and I think an important issue to talk about. So it was really good to have this chance to converse on it.
Absolutely. Thanks for letting me talk a lot. And I appreciate, you yeah, just having me on here and the ability to talk about some of these projects I've done. I'm very grateful for the people who make these projects happen. Both the book and the West St. Paul Reader were Kickstarter projects where people stepped up to support, and I'm so grateful for that. It's always great to have people support the work you do, and I couldn't do it without them. So I'm very grateful for that.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Take care.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Well, I want to thank Kevin for being my guest today. I want to add one thing here about local news. There are a lot of hyper local news outlets out there that I would strongly suggest that you check out and support, and you may even find one in your own hometown. One such example is Flint Beat, and this is a digital news outlet that is in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. Flint native Jaquanda Johnson started Flint Beat in 2017, and it recently won an local Emmy for its reporting. There's an article in the show notes about Jaquanda and how she started Flint Beat. Please give it a read. And also, as I said, be on the lookout for hyperlocal news in your area. Find it, maybe consider reading from it, and consider supporting it. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. There are, as I've said before, a lot of podcasts out there, and I am very thankful for your support. Again, make sure to visit our website, enroutepodcast.org, where you can sign up to be on the mailing list of the newsletter, listen to past episodes, and actually read some past articles that I've written. You can also go to the website to make a donation to support this podcast. And again, don't forget to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or whatever podcast platform you listen to. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a rating or a written review on Apple Podcasts. That's it for this episode of En Route, Notes on Religion, Politics, and Culture. I'm Dennis Sanders. Take care and Godspeed.